So this isn't where we'd normally be filming. I'm probably going to catch as much in here as I would outside. It's about -1, I think. It was -6 last night. But the lakes have got a lid on it, so there's nothing we can do. And we set out doing something this month. Actually, will next month, but I'm not going to go and fish in a lake that I've got to keep making channels in the ice. So we are here in my man cave, and rather than go and bore you all with the fish that are on my wall, I decided we'll talk about those fish because I've been fishing for a number of years, and I've got fish that are on this wall behind me that not necessarily the biggest fish or ones that I want to remember, but they're the ones that are there, or the ones that mean something. But when I do sit down here and have a look, and you kind of remember those times, and Bax, the cameraman behind this camera, just said to me, "God, you've been fishing a long time, older than me," which has made me feel really old. And he's referring to the fact that I've got hair in a number of those pictures, which is quite amusing because yes, I did once have hair. I thought what we'd do is have a quick look at some of these pictures because it got me thinking as well, in the respect that the rigs that we used back then, all the way till now, and I was trying to think, well, has it really moved on, or is it, or are we still applying the same sort of ethos that we did in the early 90s, late 80s, all the way till now? And there's some rigs that are still relevant to now. Certainly, I remember that 1992, some of those we got. Over here, there's Cops Lake Scaly, which I believe is still around now, which is incredible. It moved from the Cops Lake and went into the Match Lake, and that was the one known as a pretty one. And there's a picture there with the boys, and all the socials back then were amazing. But Yateley always was reminiscent for that. So I thought we'd start with that. We start in the early 90s, and I think then it was interesting because it did sort of change, as I remember, with the sort of hooks that we were using, and I've still got them, so I'll show you them in a mo. But from we moved from, say, Dacron to then we went to Christ and Silkworm, and there was a bit where we were experimenting with stiff hook links like Amnesia to great success, and the hinge stiff rig has been around for absolutely years, and it's still doing the business now. So I just wanted to have a look, show you what we've done over the years. So let's start with the early 90s. I look at this now with quite amazement, but you have to remember the rods that we were using back then were sort of, lots of people had like Sportex rods. I had Diver Whisker Kevlars that were £2 test curve, which now we use nearly 3.5, £4 test curves for most things. So with that in mind, this rig here was one that I caught quite a few fish out of Match Lake, or something definitely similar to this anyway. So very early lead here that was uncoated, or those days, and this still the same now, they're known as zip leads. I used to really be into my inline leads, as a number of friends did. Obviously you always were fishing fairly hard bottom with these style leads, but the hook link material was usually silkworm. You'd have a length of tubing on this, otherwise it would just end up as a complete ball, which is a bit of a nightmare. And subsequently the coated braid started coming out. But in those days we had silkworm. I haven't got any of silkworm, so this is trickster, but it's a similar sort of behavioural properties that it has. I was using double hook baits then, and even back then I still apply the same sort of theory as I do now. I always prefer a bottom bait that's got almost like a longer hook bait, so that it's either a double or it's got a topper on it. Reason being is that when it goes in the mouth, I like to think that it's harder for them to eject it, so the hook is likely to do a better job at trying to grab the bottom lip. When you've got like just a single boilie, they can literally toss it around in their mouths and throw it out, and the hook isn't able to do what you want it to do. That's just my theory. It's each to their own. There's the longer hairs can make a difference and all sort of stuff. But getting back to this way that this rig worked, here is a hook called a Drennan lure hook, which you look at the wire on it, and it's literally like a safety pin. It's even not even as sharp as what we have nowadays. This is fascinating. I managed to go up into my archive loft and look at all the stuff that we used, and none of these hooks are sharp. You know, they look sharp, but they're not in comparison to what we have nowadays. So it's that side has definitely moved on. How we hook fish, I do not know. But the lure hook was used in different ways, and there was other hooks like O'Shaughnessy that were long shank hooks, and then at the time the creation of the bent hook rig became apparent. And we were safety conscious back then, but there was some serious doubts about whether that hook was good for fish. And it used to nail a lot of fish because it was bent mid-shank, and this was a typical example of a hook that we'd use to bend the shank halfway. The hair would come off it halfway, and it would instantly turn and go straight into the bottom lip. And it was a devastating rig. To this day, we still try and use a similar sort of concept of what the bent hook was about. But during those days, when we realised that it wasn't particularly right to use bent hooks, we were using Jim Gibbington would create something called a liner, where the line would come out the front of the tubing underneath the eye. But the lure hook, even used straight, just as it is here, it did really well for me, and I knew a number of friends that did well as well. But again, you get anything in weed in that, and you try and pull it out. It's just, let's say, it's a safety pin, but it did its job. So that's really early days. I still use fixed lead setup, heavy tubing usually. Wasn't really using lead core, pinning things down behind. Not quite. Didn't pay as much attention as I probably would during the years subsequent after that. So yeah, but that's that. Then when I went over to the Cops Lake, an amnesia rig. Now I used to use it with a soft hair, tubing on the shank, and here, this hook here, was a Drennan Boilie hook. Thicker in wire, but still nothing like what we got nowadays. And that's how sharp it is. Literally put the pressure of my finger on the point. But we used to use it, didn't I? I never sharpened it. And this just comes straight out of a box, so it hasn't lost its sharpness at all. It just didn't have it in the first place. So yeah, that was very popular, and Drennan Star Points we used to use a lot during those days. The stiff rig is extremely popular nowadays. It's never changed, and I still use it religiously. You almost always know that you're fishing, which is important. The anti-tangle properties, which we used to really suffer from back then, are almost non-existent because of the nature of it not being able to do a ball on itself as such. And once it goes into the mouth, that part there, any part that goes into it, literally, the hook doesn't want to turn. So it always did what you wanted the hook to do, which is to go straight onto the bottom lip, nail them. Brilliant rig, more used as a D rig now, and I still love it as a bottom rig. Absolute fail safe. So from mid-90s to now, not much has changed apart from hooks. I'd still use amnesia now. No problems using that material whatsoever. Great stuff. Although I'd probably choose a Mirage £30, that sort of thing, fluorocarbon over it. But yeah, again, I'd still use it now. So, but before we move on, I have found all these hooks up in my loft, and they're great. Obviously, a little bit cheaper back then. Got the price stickers still on them. I used to work in this shop years ago, so they've all got the price stickers still on them. Drennan hooked size 8. Used to use a lot of them. I think I used size 6s at some point, but the size 8 was one I used to always go to. So that one we've just touched on. This was massively popular. But these ones are spade end hooks. They're called Maruta Kinroos. Reason being is they were the sharpest that we could get our hands on in those days. They had a combination of strength and sharpness. But you look at the wire on them again. Safety pin comes to mind. Super Specialist Drennan, really brilliant hook. Loved using that. I reckon there's a lot of people that are still catching carp on them nowadays. Then they went a little bit more into carp fishing, dedicated with boilie hooks. Drennan yet again. This is long before my association with Gardner, who revolutionised a lot of hook patterns to this day. And these are the fancy hooks of these ones. Look at these, a bit better packaging, but they've never been opened. Partridge of Redditch. They were Rod Hutchinson's, I don't know what OW stands for, but carp hook, somebody would know out there. High carbon Sheffield steel safety pin. And we also had WS Specimen Hunter ones. £1.90 a pack of, is it 10 in it? Yeah, 10 in there. Oh, and then if you're really posh, I remember these ones as well. Really posh, you go for the grey shadows. Size 8s. Flash pointed with a niffler finish. See that was revolutionary back then, because the Teflon hooks are what we sort of all use now. So I think that was definitely early 90s. Definitely. Would I use one now? If I wanted to lose a carp, probably. Anyway, let's move on. When I really started enjoying my fishing again, and that's why I had some of the pictures that we had, I spent about 8 years on road lake, which is, I look back and I think, how on earth did I spend that length of time there? But it was just, everything you kind of want in fishing was, for me, was there. It was very weedy, it was crystal clear. We had an amazing syndicate, so it was a small bunch of guys, so you were able to communicate every day, more or less, see what's going on, and it was a good click, real good click. And yeah, I my affiliation with that was 8 years, and I'm still a bailiff of it now. So in those 8 years, the obsession for me was this one here called Clover. Just an absolute beast of a fish, and I saw it come out enough times obviously in that period, but it took me a while to get that, and that was one of the best fishing day of my life. I think it was April the 2nd, very early, and I've been fishing it all winter, and I remember I was using Mike Wilmot's winterized Essential B5, brilliant bait, and it wasn't an easy water road lake over winter, but at least it was intimate, and you always felt that you were in with a little bit of a shout. But before that, the summers were absolutely wonderful. I caught probably a majority of the stock that was in there, but I never had the big ling, and I never had the big dink. Yeah. But I did double up on a number of others and caught some great fish, but it was always, you could never pull off until you had the one you wanted. And when I had Clover, that was it for me. I was sort of, I kind of felt like I'd done what I needed to do. And I was fortunate enough to get a place on a Dead Man's Shoe syndicate, which I'll allude to what we did on there, or what I did on there after I left the road lake. Always like looking at them. These ones are some funny, good rigs. I'll show you now. I'm going to start off with this rig that looks nothing, but it used to be devastating. The actual material, for example, here I'm using Gardner's Trickling, which wasn't the actual stuff we were using in the day. It was actually Terry Eustace gold label stuff called Black Stiffy. It was a really stiff, almost like stiffer than Amnesia. Used to tie it up onto like a mugger hook, and a size 8 mugger hook, and you'd continue, continue with the hair. So there was no other material other than this Amnesia type hook link. And as you can see, the gape was almost non-existent. You look at it, you think, so when it sat in the water, it was almost like the hook was turning back on itself. It was just the most crude and peculiar looking rig. Fish normally with a big bolt bomb and a leg clip. This rig used to nail fish. It really did. It was just, you'd have the inch back in the mouth, perfect hook hold, and yeah, it did. I caught a few fish out of this. However, I lost a few and all, and I was losing them quite early into a fight. It was actually parting. The stuff was parting. And the weed that was in the road lake, there was loads of pea mussels and all sorts in it, and this stuff, it just wasn't very abrasive. And I tried other materials, and you can't take that risk. If the hook link wasn't going to survive touching the weed in any form, then you had to ditch it. So eventually I had to change and kind of went to conventional sort of materials, like I've got with the rig that I'm about to show, which is the Suffolk stuff that we had back then. We used to have the cam fusion and the sheepskin, and that's what we used to use back then. So abrasion resistance was excellent on it, as you can imagine. But this rig, I loved it. I just loved it because it was just something very, very cool. And I'd use it with a single bait, didn't use a double bait like I've just said that I used historically, which I would use if there's any sort of flexibility near that hook area. This is more what I was using over the summer months. The rig that I had, the Clover that I spoke about a minute ago, this one yet again was a little bit different. I decided I was baiting a couple of areas on the Road Lake and had a couple of fish over the winter. There was a swim called the Grassy Knoll, and I was in touch with it, walking the lake a lot, just spending more time looking than I was actually fishing, which is no bad thing in the winter months. And I could see a couple of almost just bubbles coming from an area, just literally pinprick bubbles coming up. And it was a rod length out, and the area was a nice little hole, firm area, and I'd been baiting it for about a month, but never fished it. Just left it. And when you get that feeling, the time was right, and it was cold, April the 2nd, as I said, and I went down there and it was time to fish it. I didn't get down there till late and cast this little rig out, which comprised yet again the size 8 mugger hook, which I loved, an inline lead, which I still love now. Reason being because you've got no movement when that fish picks it up. It's bump. There's nothing flexing around what you get with a swivel sort of thing. So it's always instant. A cam fusion type hook link. This is the type of stuff it was. Double hook bait, and this little thing here, but it was in yellow, and it was an Enterprise maggot grub. It was visual. These baits were red. I think anything that gives that little sparkle, that little bit of visual, helps it. But the best thing about putting the Enterprise grub on it is it was just the way the hook turned. It really turned quickly, and it would always flip. So the hook point was banging the bottom lip, and it was great over the winter. Yet again, I look at that and I think, God, I bet that worked now. Great rig, really was. Then I moved on to this wonderful lake that I just said about, which is, fortunately, is one of those all too common places now that's got publicity banned on it. So I can't divulge exactly where it is, but it had some real special fish in it, and I got obsessed with the place. I think it's probably the only place that I really got obsessed with, trying to find every hour in the day to get there, and before you know it, and I've seen everybody else that's joined there as well go through the same process. They just want to fish there, and I keep trying to tell people that it's not going away, so just try and abide your time, because if you catch them all, then you can't keep doubling up on them. And I went through the first season I was there. I did so well just by basic chod fishing, like this. That had, it's not really changed much to this day really. That stop there is just as for reference, but I'd have that slid quite high up, so you'd have about 5-6 foot of 25-pound plummet leg core, the thin stuff that Gardner do, which is lovely, really soft. Always had a breakaway lead, really small little bolt bomb lead, and a long piece of tubing covering it. The tubing was really there to stop the hook getting whacked by the lead, because that was often where, if you had this chop rig go all the way down to the swivel of the lead, a lot of hook balls were quite commonplace. So always gave yourself a little bit of distance from the lead to the hook link itself. And I always liked a really long boom. That's about 2.5-3 inches boom on that chod section. I still like that now. I don't really like small chods. I think if you fish them regularly, and certainly the way that I did at the time, if I could almost know exactly where the hook was going to go into the fish's mouth. If I used a shorter boom, it would be more on the edge of the fish's mouth than it was with the longer. So naturally, I wanted a longer hook link, and it worked. I was fishing real soft sill, real easy fishing, really easy. Not the spots that everybody was getting used to over there, because we were allowed boats, so you could go out there and you could see the spots from the side of the boat, and you go, oh, you know, big yellow areas in amongst the weed, and they look absolutely banging for a bite. But the fish knew that's where people were fishing for them. Whereas there were some really nice silt beds out in front of a number of swims that you couldn't really get a drop on. You couldn't feel the lead go down because it would literally plug itself in there. It was almost like looking over the boat. It looked like sand. It was sort of like sand dunes. It was quite something to see. So you knew that you needed a choddy really so that you could sit above it, because if I'd used a normal conventional rig, it would have probably just plugged in there. So yeah, that did really well, but I never got the big girl out of that. The big girl was what we call a fish that was known as little grey. I was fortunate enough to catch that twice, but that came out to a rig known as a Kenny Dorset rig, or a KD rig. Really basic, yet again, knotless knot, 5 times up, then bring the hair back on itself, and then go 3 times behind the hair, so it sort of came out at an angle mid-shank. No tubing, nothing like that. But what it was a pop-up, and so what would happen is the weight here, like a BB shot, would just sit there, so that the pop-up was really acting like a bottom bait. And yeah, you're relying on obviously the fish to take the bait as far back as possible in order for the hook to do its job. So I was fishing this with just a lot of boilie pieces, broken up boilies, that sort of stuff. So really to try and give the fish the confidence to suck the bait up harder than what they would say if you were using particle. But yeah, this is the one that nailed it. I don't use this much anymore, but yet again, you know, people do. It's a good rig. What we're using here, ultra skin, Gardener's ultra skin. So you're using a braided hook, coated hook link, and yet again, my favourite, inline lead. I didn't use it that often, but just wanted, I don't know why, I just could not get the grey to come out on a choddy. And the funniest thing was it was a different sort of feeder to some of the other fish, and it passed away in the last couple of years, but it had a graze on its sort of chest. I was speaking to that about in the last film with Simon, where it used to feed really hard closer to the deck, and I don't know, but the chod rigs just didn't seem to do it for me. But that said, I knew a chap called Kodak who caught a few years ago using a chod, so probably just luck of the draw. After my little flit on the Syndicate Lake, I returned to the Longfield area and had a go. I think I only did about a season, to be honest, over on Foxball. Really nice lake. Had a few fish in there that I'd dearly wanted to catch, and got lucky and had a couple of them. Rigs wise, I sort of deployed the same sort of tactics as I did on the other lake with the chods. Just loved it. I was so into my chod fishing at that time. But more case because it had this weed in Fox that I don't actually know what weed it was, but it was quite very sort of furry, sort of low level weed that smelled gorgeous, really did, and it was alive with all sorts of creatures, and I just thought that has to be good. So the chod rig was perfect to sit on that. Yeah, it was easy fishing, able to nick quite a few. Caught the dark one. It was not on that board there, but there's whiskers up and in the top left there. That was about 37, I think, something like that. Really nice character fish. Didn't do too much time on there. Just got quite lucky in the time that I was there, but enjoyed it. Yeah, again, it was nice fishing. But rigs wise, yeah, pretty much the same as what I'd been using. And it's kind of getting to that point now where didn't do much different. I recall just coming into sort of like about 5 years ago now that I returned back to the road lake to try and catch this one here. The smile says it all. I was rough. I was about as rough as I am now when I caught that. But that was brilliant. The winter, it was really quiet over there. And as I said before, it's a nice lake during those sort of cold months because it's so intimate, so small, so you're never far away from them. Not easy, but they're catchable. And yeah, I had a couple of the smaller ones, the stockies, and then one night on there in a swim called the Hump, very famous swim. That one gave me a visit. I think it was ounce short, 39, something like that. But real old fish, and it survived. I think 2 fish kills that survived. That's wiped out all the other stock. So it's an absolute warrior. And unfortunately, it passed away this year. But great fish, and that was on the ever so conventional and rig that everybody sort of uses to a certain degree, hinge stiff rig. Oh God, how long has that been going, that rig? And it's still probably a go-to for most people, despite some of the advancements that's happened with the spinner rigs or running rigs, whatever you want to call them. But the hinge stiff rig worked for me, and the lake that I visited afterwards as well. You've seen this so many places, but I will bore you with it anyway. The boom comprises of a 25-pound Gardner Mirage fluorocarbon, and the hook link piece section is 25-pound stiff link to a BCR size 6 hook, and normal sort of bait screws, whatever you want to use, normal sort of slide on the ring itself. So nothing has really changed in all those years. We used to tie the baits on, or you can use the new sort of hook swivels, which I personally like, because you want everything moving. That's what we always try and achieve, is everything spinning. You got the part here where it's all spinning around, and this bit here, you got the hook bait itself is spinning around. You've got the loops you tend to make as large as possible, really, so you've got loads of movement. Yet again, gives it that so much more freedom to move around in. Brilliant rig. Caught, well, some of the best fish in the country, hasn't it? So I'd either use it on a leg clip or I'd use it on a helicopter. Usually with this type of rig, I like to fish it on firm bottom. Not really one that's a little bit choddy or whatever, because it's got a stiff boom and you don't want it doing that sort of sitting up. You want it lying down like that. When it's behaving in that way and it's sitting like that, it's devastating rig. And it's still one of my favourite rigs, and a number of my good friends' favourite rig as well. So after Freescales, which was late March, I think, because my ticket started on the car park lake. I went back to the car park, which was the first time I've gone to a lake. First time I've gone somewhere and I don't know anybody. What a great move that was. I've met some of the nicest anglers I've ever come across. Still good friends with them all now. Lovely bunch, and it was what Yatey was about. Yatey used to be an amazing. Wasn't a syndicate back then. I mean, when I started, the ticket was 14 quid for half a season. But yeah, I mean, went back there and it was like, you'd have barbecues, you'd have a few beers, you'd enjoy everybody's catcher. It's what it was about. It was a proper syndicate. And I never fished a car park. I fished the north, and the car park, to be honest, it looked like an old workings lake. It wasn't very nice. And in all fairness to Martin, who runs that side of that complex now, it was stunning. I thought, God, this is lovely. And I fluked. I'm going to say fluked, because I fluked the bullet hole common, which is that one up there. And it is absolutely stunning. Right at the top corner, absolutely stunning fish. It was a special place, but yeah, I had that same rig as Freescales. You know, if it ain't broke, don't try and fix it. And it was, you know, I prefer to use a pop up at the early time of the year, because you know you still got the leaf matter on the ground, and you just want something sitting above it. And that was on a little spot I found sort of out there, and yeah, I got fortunate. And you know, so that's what happens, isn't it? I see that happening on Dinton all the time, with somebody who's just started and say, well, how's my luck? Got a fish straight away. But sometimes it makes you wonder whether we overthink it. But yeah, I had a couple of seasons over there, and the other rig was quite conventional. They always were partial to a cell wafter. They loved it over there. So yeah, and it was sort of nothing special, sort of standard bottom bait rig. But the hinge stiff rig was the one in the colder months, and just as the season was starting. One below it, that was a bit of a mug, to be honest. The one we called 2 scale, but I put it up there because it's just as I said, the boys that are around, it just reminds me. I think that all of us that fished it, you can't beat that. It's so nice when you've got a bunch of lads that are happy for you and are able to share that moment and enjoy it. I think that for me, that's what makes me want to go and enjoy my fishing. It's really, really good. And those boys, they were certainly a great bunch. But I only did a couple of seasons and then went to Dinton. And that's where we sort of coming into the rigs that we use now. And really not much change other than the spinner rigs that are probably, I won't say revolutionised, but yet again it's similar to what I was just showing on the hinge stiff rig, is that it provides more greater movement of that hook bait when it gets in a fish's mouth. I'll show you the rig that I used for the sort of first year on Dinton that I had a decent result where I caught. That is an absolute banger of a fish. It's called the second fully scaled. That was just an amazing fish, and I've got some great pictures of that one, and there's some catches as well, which I've sort of put in, and the same with a match lake one. Don't ask me why I've done that, but that's Mr. Angry down there. Another absolute character who used to have his dorsal fin up all the time. It's a funny thing, but yeah, again, very old fish. And some of these ones that are here, these two here, I had a really good autumn campaign with the rig I'll just about to show you. But these are like the future as far as I'm concerned, because there's always, we've got the A team that are in there at the moment. We lost one this year called the Grey, and you always, that's part of great fishery management. It's what's going to come through. Years ago, it was on Dinton, it was Sid, it was Bruno. If anyone's seen that thing I've just done with Simon, he's talking about it, but he's always planning for the future and always knows that the lake isn't, if you don't manage it into the way that he does and other good fishery managers do, then that lake is only good for a short while, and then once those fish go, there's nothing coming through, and you can't just stock something with instantaneous big fish. You need to work it, and so this one here was, I think you went 42, and we caught that for the cameras, which is amazing. And it's like, well, they're just going one way. They're just getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and they're still quite young. So that's why I got them up there. It's great to see what's happening on that lake. So I'll show you that rig anyway. When I was using a hinge stiff rig, and I just said the fact that if the bottom wasn't quite as firm as you'd like, and you're a little bit, there's a little bit choddy, then I'd nearly always use a very similar variation of that rig, and which is the Combi Link rig, which is yet again you're utilising the Ultra Skin Garden Do, but you've got that section there fundamentally is the same as what you'd use on a hinge stiff rig. We've just lost the boom and we've replaced it with Ultra Skin or a skin hook link, and that is joined by means of an Albright knot, and the Albright knot is covered with a piece of putty, which then weights it down. So you've got that little bit more movement, little bit more flexibility over rough ground, and that would make my decision as whether I would use a hinge stiff rig. If it was a flat bottom and a hard bottom, then I'd 9 times out of 10 use a hinge. That said, I'd also like to be using it over bait, over boilie, not with particles. If you're fishing with anything bits and pieces, I don't want that sitting above when the fish are actually going to be feeding there. So you want them to be, coming down and being able to pick the bait up. Of course, there's boilies that are going to be underneath it, but it's a different mentality the way that they feed. They're not hoovering. If you ever watch any videos that are out there, they're not hoovering. They're sort of literally sucking up from here, and that's why the pop-ups work so efficiently, because the hook is always in the right place and it's able to nail them. The rig that was used a couple of years ago, that really worked September, October, I think I had inline lead again, so I was fishing hard bottom. I used a very long piece of fluorocarbon. This is, again, I always like the 25 pound Mirage fluorocarbon, size 6 Gardner Mugger hook with a spinner sort of set up. No loop on the swivel itself, so literally tied to the swivel. The flexibility comes in the form of the hair. The hair was just tied onto the top shank of the hook. The hook bait, just a bottom bait. topped off with a Enterprise piece of corn. So I was baiting with more when I left. I was baiting with sort of bits and pieces, but fishing over just boilie when I was actually there, which is something I just like doing. This accounted for most of the fish that I've just showed. Why was I using such a long hook link? No real science behind it, just the fact that everybody was using really short hook links. So it's kind of like, well, I know these fish are pretty clever, so I might as well just try something different. And the hooking was excellent. I was always getting the right hook holds, and I carried on using it until literally when it hit the middle of October, when the bites sort of started drying up, and then moved over to the other method, which is, well, I actually stopped fishing it over in the winter then, and started going over to zigging, which is very popular over Dinton now, but with the weed that's in there at the moment, this year, I don't think it's going to be that popular, but we'll see. So winter is an absolute nightmare on Dinton, which is a bit of a shame because I don't have many other options but to persevere a bit. But I decided to do a social with my mate Gary over just after Christmas, 2 years ago this was, and lo and behold, we went down there and they were boshing out all over the place in the middle of the lake. It was just bizarre. Like, I mean, they show a lot anyway, but to see him like that, I mean, you're going to get a bite. We were going to go somewhere like Farlow's and see if we can get a bite, but we decided to go to there. So we fished, and Gary had fish right over him, but couldn't get a bite. And I soon became aware that these fish are a bit ziggy. And during January, I had 3 bites out there in January, which was just great because there was no one there, and zigs are a bit alien to me. You know, managing to go and fish when it's really cold and get a bite is brilliant. And one of the best ones I've had is that one there. He was caught at completely the other end to where I'd had a couple of bites, just shy of £30, I think that was. An absolute stunner, as they most of them are. But that was actually, which I didn't tell anybody because you have to down there, but that was with a bit of foam and Dedrobina worms threaded onto the foam. And it looks quite a sight when it's in the water because they stay active. One was staying active for a good 15 hours, no problem at all. So you'd either use zigging is all about getting the distances right. So I'd normally use this is just for filming purposes. So you got a lead that must barely be on a lead clip. So you want that lead coming off. You do not want that on when you're playing a fish. If you can imagine, if you're fishing, as I was, about 8 foot, anything between 6 and 8 foot zigs, you don't want that going around, and that's what you want it to do, fall off. So on this particular one, you can see I've got a piece of black foam, which is, you want, this is a black cylindrical piece of foam that's been cut so that it sits into the shank of the hook. Bit of silicone tubing pushing it right up. And it's mine's kind of blobbed with a piece of almost amnesia type hook link running through it to hold it into place. But what I do here is thread some dental floss into it, and then thread your worms on it. You want the normal sewing sort of needle, and then you tie the worms onto it, so you create this sort of Medusa effect. It still floats up perfectly normal. That adds a real great bit of attraction. But I had a couple out on it, and then all of a sudden, as usual with Dinton, this sort of novelty wore off by the fish, and I never got more. But most of the time, most of the bites that we were having were like this, just a piece of foam with a little bit of red splash on it. Something about it. And the hook link, and that's why I said if there's too much weed, you don't really want to be zigging, that's £10 bottom. So if a fish gets in a weed and you've got to try and get it out of there, you're going to have a job on your hands with £10 line. So you need to apply a bit of sensible way of thinking in that one. I realise I've got my kids up here, this is on Dinton. We had that's my eldest daughter Livy. She won't come fishing with me now. She's 15. I've got no chance. and I suppose I go fishing to get a bit of peace and quiet now anyway. But yeah, we had 2 overnight on the zigs at Dinton, so that was good. My boy over there, that's from the private syndicate. Is he into it yet? I'm trying to get him into it, but not quite there yet. Never rush these things. If he wants to do it, he wants to do it, great. But I want him to discover the love of fishing like I have. So that leads us to the modern day, and what's changed? Well, pretty much I still adopting the spinner rigs, which is similar to what I was using the year before. I'm using pop-ups more than I was on, say, bottom baits. Why have I changed that? I know you look at it and it's sort of the spinner rig as a pop-up, and you use a pop-up on it, it's pretty much on the deck. So you could argue whether it's a bottom bait or whether it's a pop-up. I always like to think a pop-up is like what we're using with a hinge stiff rig or something like that, when it's sitting sort of 2-3 inches off the bottom. But nowadays with a spinner rig, we're sort of right on the deck. You know, you're sort of fishing like that high up. But at the moment, that's what I haven't got triple row up there, and I haven't got snake, which is the last couple of good fish that I've had out of Dinton. That rig is pretty much what I'm using. So this is pretty much what I'm using at the moment. Yeah, again, of course I'm going to adapt. It depends on what I'm fishing over. Still a huge fan of chop rigs. Absolutely love the things. But this, for baited areas, rig shy carp, this is a sort of my go-to rig, which has worked for the last couple of good fish that I've had. Yet again, Gardner mugger hook, size 6. Don't use them 4s much, and a lot of my friends love the 4s. I don't use them much. It's just me. The 6 does exactly what it needs to do for my liking. I have a loop onto the swivel, hook swivel. Everything's able to spin, which is what I want it to do. That's spinning. This part's spinning. That's why it's called a spinner rig, or although some know it as a Ronnie rig. It's just very, very effective rig. Hook link, £30 Mirage. Love my Mirage. I've done for years and years and years. And I'll either, depending on the bottom, yet again, it's either going to be a helicopter rig, lead clip, or an inline lead. All depends on what I'm fishing over, but this tends to be my go-to. What's changed from sort of from the beginning of this film? The rigs, obviously in the early 90s, that's when it sort of changed, when we went to the stiff sort of hook link setups. But from there, has there been that much change? I don't think so, really. But certainly it from the days of the Drennan lure hooks and stuff like that, with the really thin wire hooks, and the introduction of we all use much stiffer rods now, so your tackle, your end tackle needs to be a lot stronger. The gauge of hooks and also the technology and how sharp they are. Yes, we hand sharpen them to make them all that better, but out of the packet, the hooks are much sharper than they used to be. Will there be any more changes? I don't know. I did muck around with some rigs that a friend of mine called it the Nora, and that had an elasticated boom section to it. And I've done a bit of trial and error with stuff like that. But yeah, again, it's one of those rigs that really effective if it's presenting well. You don't know whether it is because it's got bits of elastic in it, and you had to literally hand place it. A friend of mine still uses it religiously, but I sort of head away from it. But there you go. There's a normal, conventional, boring spinner rig.